Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute at the University of Melbourne. I'm Georgina Downer and I'm the host of Afternoon Light and the CEO of the Robert Menzies Institute. The Institute is a prime ministerial library and museum devoted to upholding the legacy and vision of Sir Robert Menzies, Australia's longest-serving Prime Minister. On Afternoon Light, we explore contemporary issues relevant to Sir Robert's life and legacy with leading thinkers from around the world. Thank you for joining us today. Hello and welcome to the Afternoon Light podcast. Today I am speaking to Will Sanders, who is an Honorary Associate Professor with the Centre for Aboriginal Economic Policy Research at the Australian National University. He regularly works on Indigenous people's participation in elections, on housing and social security policy issues, and on federal and intergovernmental aspects of Indigenous Affairs policy. Welcome, Will, to the Afternoon Light podcast.
Thank you, Jordana. My pleasure to be with you.
It's great to have you on the podcast, and today we're going to talk about Indigenous policy in the Menzies era, and particularly the contribution of Menzies' Minister for Territories, Paul Hasluck, who was Minister from 1951 to 63. It doesn't bear thinking about being a minister for 12 years these days.
12 years.
Quite an extraordinary. And then he followed through with being Minister for External Affairs as well, didn't he? So
correct.
An extraordinary achievement. But I wanted to start, Will, by asking you about Indigenous policy under Robert Menzies, who was Prime Minister the second time around from 49 to 66, so over 16 years. What did it exist? Was it articulated as such?
Well, I think the first thing you need to think about, thinking back that far, is that Indigenous policy was in those years for the Commonwealth was primarily conducted through territories policy. So, as you've just noted, Minister Hasluck was the Minister for Territories, and as Minister for Territories, he convened an Aboriginal Welfare Council of the various state ministers for Aboriginal welfare. So most of what we now think of as Indigenous policy was conducted through the Commonwealth Territories portfolio. And that had the important implication that the states were more seen as equals in that arrangement. It was Hasluck, as Minister for Territories, was sort of the leader of the Indigenous ministers around the country. There's no two ways about that, but he was on the same level because he was running a region, policy in a region, like others were, rather than running policy nationally. So that's a big change. When you need to think about that when you're thinking your way back into this stuff.
And of course that limited the ability of the Commonwealth to do very much outside of the territory. Yeah,
one of the things I wrote about a quarter of a century ago was there was pressure for the Commonwealth to do more through using its monetary powers, but both Hasluck and Menzies resisted making Section 96 type grants to the states to help them with Aboriginal welfare issues. They thought that, each jurisdiction should use its own money to do its own Indigenous policy, and they weren't going to try and influence what people did by spending money with and putting conditions on it, which is sort of what we have done in later years through the post-67 pattern, is to sort of, Commonwealth says, we want this done, we'll give you the money to do it on these conditions, that sort of pattern. So they were very much against that pattern. So the Commonwealth could have done more, but it didn't want to. It wanted to just be doing Indigenous policy in the territory or in the territories and leaving the states to their own devices.
And Paul Hasluck didn't come to this portfolio without experience. He had significant experience, didn't he?
He did.
In Indigenous policy.
Yeah, so Paul Hasluck was West Australian, and he had written a master's thesis on West Australian Indigenous policy from British settlement through to the early years of the 20th century, the early 1900s. So he was well versed in Indigenous policy in Western Australia, and he had some fairly firm ideas of his own from being a scholar, and he'd also been a journalist. And in 1936, he'd followed a royal commission around Western Australia looking at Indigenous circumstances in the 1930s. So he was very well versed in Indigenous policy in Western Australia, and he had fairly firm ideas of where it should be going, which was it ought to be going towards equal rights and equality before the law. So that was his big thing. Individualised legal equality was what he pushed. And I get the sense that Menzies, as his boss, was on the same wavelength and just let Hasluck get on with the job. That's. I mean, I wasn't there watching intently in the 50s or even the 60s. By the 60s, I was a schoolboy, but I wasn't paying any attention to this sort of stuff.
No.
But just looking back at it from the 80s and 90s when I was sort of looking at this stuff, it seemed to me that Hasluck was eminently competent and deeply interested, and therefore Menzies just let him run with it, I think. That's my sense.
Do you know, Will, what led Hasluck in Perth? He was at UWA in the 30s. What led him to want to do a master's thesis on Aboriginal affairs? Because it would have been not a terribly mainstream field of inquiry back in the 1930s, I wouldn't have thought. Was there an experience that he had, or was it commonly studied at UWA back then?
I wouldn't have thought it was particularly commonly studied. Hasluck, look, I did, when I was doing this work, Hasluck was a person who interested me, and he does seem to have been quite a reformer in his own right in Indigenous affairs in the 30s and 40s and 50s. Like, pushing for equal rights then was sort of pushing against a sort of pattern of separate restrictive laws justified in the name of protection. And so I think in that sense Hasluck was in his time a reformer and quite a questioning sort of person. Why do we have these separate restrictive protective laws? But by the end of his 30 years in politics, equal rights was not where the action was. So in the end, he looked like we all do, that was sort of some echo of the past. Yeah. But I think he was genuinely interesting person. It was him that really got me into thinking about the Menzies era, because I did my PhD on the inclusion of Aboriginal people in the social security system in this period of the 50s and 60s and 70s. And this notion of equal rights was very important to that.
Yes.
Because they had been legislatively excluded. Aboriginal natives were legislatively excluded. And then there had to be a process of bringing them in or getting rid of these exclusionary provisions. Yeah. And so the idea of equal rights was a reforming idea to give people access and give Indigenous people access to social security.
And of course was a very small L liberal idea of equality as well. The interesting thing that Hasluck introduced, different from the state policies of protective segregation she was describing, was this sort of idea of assimilation. And we've seen this in Australia, not just with Indigenous policy, but of course in migration policy as well, where new migrants to Australia are asked to assimilate, to become like other Australians rather than sort of identify strongly with their own culture once they come to Australia.
He ends up looking a bit like a conservative there, because he doesn't really embrace the idea that Indigenous people will want to continue to identify with and their existing Indigenous culture. So that's where he ends up looking like a conservative. But, you know, he sort of this inclusive equal rights push is quite progressive at the time. So it is interesting how you can sort of move from being progressive inclusive to being a group. He was at the same time a sort of group conservative. So
can you talk a bit about what his position on assimilation was in the 40s, but through 50s and 60s?
Look, I think he thought that Aboriginal society was sort of being destroyed by settlement, by invasion, and so that the best chance that Indigenous people had was to sort of follow this equal rights path and become, you know, assimilate into the dominant society. And, you know, in a sense, that's the sort, you talk about this in the migrant policy tradition as well. The best chance the people have is to assimilate and get on in the dominant society. What that sort of line underappreciates is how much people will want to continue to sort of draw from their roots and their heritage. And so that comes back to the fore in this sort of, you know, Walpuri want to be Walpuri and Narrandjeri want to be Narrandjeri, and so that people have these group attachments that they feel very strongly and they want to develop and follow through on. They want to revive languages or keep languages and not just join in the dominant English-speaking colonial society. So, yeah.
And so this policy of assimilation that Hasluck was introducing and fostering, he introduces this, and I think it's adopted by a meeting of Commonwealth and State Ministers in January 1961 and really became the cornerstone of Indigenous policy up until the middle of the 1970s. How was it actually affected then through what sort of policies were we seeing?
Well, a lot of the legislative change was towards equal rights. So there were lots of provisions in lots of pieces of both Commonwealth and state legislation which restricted Aboriginal people's rights under that legislation. And so that's where a lot of the work was done in Indigenous policy during these years. And there's a lot of steps involved. It's not just one or two steps. So in the Social Security legislation, you get a three-step. You get a 1949 step in the 1940s and before. Basically, Aboriginal natives are all excluded from the Social Security legislation. In 1949, ex-servicemen get access to Social Security because there's quite a few Indigenous people who've served in World War II, and you know it's sort of you've allowed us to serve to fight for the country, but you're not giving us Social Security. So they got access in 49, and then in 59 there was a general exclusion. There was a big fanfare about a general inclusion, but a new phrase was invented called nomadic and primitive. The nomadic and primitive Aboriginal natives were not included. And then it was 1966 that you get the third step, where literally you get to the point where the Social Security legislation has no references in it to Aboriginal natives at all. So it's sort of inclusion by not referring to a category of people, which is a sort of a funny negative form of public policy, but it's you can understand it. It's very much in line with this equal rights idea that Hasluck had in mind. That and I think Menzies went along with, that you include people by getting rid of the exclusionary provisions, and what you get is bodies of laws which just make no reference at all.
No, they just cover everyone. Natives. They're universal in their application because they don't identify a group per se.
And that's the basic pattern. And of course, one of the things to note is that those three dates in the social security legislation are all pre-1967. You don't need 1967 constitutional alteration referendum to do this. You can write general laws from a Commonwealth perspective which exclude Aboriginal people, or you can write general laws, Commonwealth laws, which include Aboriginal people by not referring to them. And you can do that entirely without raising this issue of Section 5126 of the Commonwealth Constitution and its span. So, and that's what Hasluck and Menzies were doing. Interestingly, of course, the Social Security story, which is the one that drew me in as a PhD student back in the early 80s, which I was sort of fascinating, is less well known than the franchise story, the getting the vote. But I don't think that the vote is all that well understood, because it went down a slightly different path because we had compulsory voting. So most people, if they know that the vote didn't change in 1967, they know that it's probably changed in 1962. But most people haven't thought about it all that much, because what happened in 1962 is that Aboriginal natives got the right to voluntary enrolment, because there was quite a lot of reservation about making it compulsory. Like, it had been compulsory for Australians over 18 since 1924 to enrol to vote, and it was there were reservations about making it compulsory for Aboriginal people to vote. And in fact, it wasn't until the Hawke government in late 1983 that Indigenous people were put on the level of it being compulsory for them to enrol with us. So there was a really interesting period there between 62 and 83 where it was voluntary for Aboriginal people to enrol to vote, but it was compulsory for other people.
And was that because of the difficulties getting to polling booths, the difficulties registering for Aboriginal people to enrol to vote and find an address that they could register? Is that what was behind that?
I don't think it was that, really. I think it was simply a matter of, it seemed rather draconian to go in one big step from excluding Aboriginal natives from voting to making it compulsory for them to enrol to vote. So that there was this sort of halfway period where it was we'll make it voluntary for people to enrol, but if you enrol, you sort of get lost in the role anyway. You're not identified on the role as Aboriginal, so you then get subject to the compulsory voting provisions. If you put yourself on the roll, it's compulsory for you to vote, like it's compulsory for anyone else to vote. And, if you don't, you'll be fined like anyone else, because you just disappear into the Commonwealth electoral roll without being identified as Aboriginal.
Sure.
But if you perchance weren't enrolled in those years, you could say, oh, well, I'm not enrolled because I'm Aboriginal and under the legislation, I have the right to, it's voluntary. And there were some other interesting aspects to it. To induce Aboriginal people to enrol was a criminal offence during those years. You had,
criminal offence.
Yeah, because it was we didn't want unnecessary, undue influence to recruit people.
Sure.
It had to be a sort of free, informed decision of the individual, not someone heavying someone else to enrol to vote. So, it's possibly not all that well appreciated that interim step that the Menzies government set up of voluntary voting for Aboriginal people in 62 lasted right through till 83.
What was the level of enrolment like once Aboriginal people were able to enrol in 1962? Was there a rush, or was it in dribs and drabs?
It's a little bit hard to tell. There was some work done in the 70s in Western Australia which suggested maybe half were enrolled. I suspect there'd be quite a lot of regional differences around the country. So not a lot of work done on it, but certainly when it becomes compulsory for people to enrol in 83, 84, after the Hawke government's changes, the Electoral Commission feels it has to do quite a lot of work getting out there and educating people and encouraging people. And so that tells you that there's sort of, they haven't really pushed it before then. And of course they come up against this undue influence, it's an offence to induce people's enrolment. So they feel constrained up until 83, 84.
Right.
So all that suggests that enrolment during those years among Aboriginal people was probably quite low, but it was also probably quite geographically variable, I suspect.
Yeah, presumably more remote areas it would have been a little lower than
I suspect
metropolitan
so.
areas. Yeah.
Well,
just coming back to the assimilation issue, were there any improvements amongst Aboriginal people in Australia on the basis of those policies, do you think? There's always shades of grey with public policy, I appreciate.
Look, I tend to refer to it as the equal rights era. I think there was a lot of appreciation of equal rights in that times. So Indigenous people were very happy to get equal rights. These go back to the late 40s of these ex-servicemen getting equal rights. They thought that was a great
So there was a sort of sense of empowerment in some respects that, now you're being given equal rights and prior, before you weren't. So that was a distinct improvement. But then there were obviously some significant detrimental effects as well.
I think that's what comes next, is that this is equal individual rights, and of course there's that sort of contentiousness about this is not a group-focused policy. This is a very individualised policy, and that then becomes the next step is, well, actually we're much more focused on Indigenous groups. And Menzies and Hasluck never got to that point.
In terms of group rights, of course, we then have the issues relating to land rights, and in the Menzies era, this with the nuclear tests in Maralinga, and of course up in the Northern Territory, there was the mining rights that were given to large mining companies, which were given without the prior approval of the local
of the group,
Indigenous people, and that ended up sparking the Yirrkala bark petitions being submitted to the federal parliament. Yep. So there were really big, contentious group-led issues around land rights and sense of sovereignty that were coming to the fore in the 50s with the nuclear tests, of course, and then later on with the bark petitions as well.
Yeah, they're 62, 63. So, I mean, you can see from those instances that the Menzies governments were not well attuned to responding to local Indigenous group petitioning of one sort or another. They didn't really have a strategy for that. So that is the other side, that they were sort of doing this individualized equal rights stuff in the legislation, and that was appreciated, but they didn't have a mindset which gave them an ability to respond to this Indigenous group stuff that was building through, as you say, Maralinga and the South Australian stuff, and then really Yirrkala and the bark petitions of 63 are the really big stuff where, this is Indigenous groups pushing their collective land rights, and don't know what to do with that. The mindset's just not there to know how to respond. I mean, in a sense, to focus back in on the constitutional provisions, most people probably understand that there was two sections of the Constitution which had exclusionary references to Aboriginal natives in them, one of which was Section 127, which simply said when counting the numbers of people of the Commonwealth, Aboriginal people should not be counted. And the other one, and both Menzies and Hasluck said, yeah, that's got to go.
Yeah.
But the other section of the Constitution which referred to Aboriginal people was one of the heads of power in Section 51, so 5126, and that's the Commonwealth's race power to this day. And that basically said the Commonwealth has a power to make special laws for the people of any race. But it said other than the Aboriginal race in any state. And that's what we got rid of, or Holt got rid of in 67. But both Hasluck and Menzies thought you didn't need to get rid of that. That was actually a protection from what special laws, they thought of special laws were going to be discriminatory laws.
Right.
And in many ways they were right, because in subsequent years, Holt took the more populist view. So both Menzies and Hasluck sort of said, no, we don't need to get rid of this. And particularly Menzies, the constitutional lawyer, sort of said, this is a protection against discrimination. This is not discrimination, because these special laws that would be made would be discriminatory laws. And so that neither of them wanted to go that way. And the constitutional alteration in relation to these two provisions never went to the referendum under Menzies. That was sort of like holding the line against the populist idea that these both had to go. Yeah. And that's what Holt went with. And so after Menzies is gone, Holt says, okay, I've got the message, we've got to get rid of both these exclusionary references from the Constitution. And of course it got a resounding vote in favour in 67.
It was amazing.
Yeah,
wasn't it?
91%. I think it's by far the biggest vote for a constitutional alteration ever. But of course, Menzies in 20 years or 30 years later again, of course, Menzies was sort of proved right. I mean, the Hindmarsh Island case basically said, actually, this power, Section 5126, to make laws for the people of any race for whom it's deemed necessary to make special laws, can be used to make laws that are adverse to those people. And so, in a sense, Menzies was right as a constitutional lawyer. But the politics had moved on. I mean, in a sense, you had to put the two together to really make sense of it.
That's really interesting. That 67 referendum, it's sort of the most well-known, I think, change really before the native title issues.
Absolutely.
In Indigenous policy and law in Australia, but it didn't happen in a vacuum, as you were explaining. I mean, there was lots that was going on beforehand, with obviously the policies of Hasluck through the 50s and 60s, but also the 1962 change enabling Indigenous people to enrol to vote if they wanted to voluntarily. But they weren't even allowed to vote in Queensland and Western Australia, so that must have been an extraordinary change. Even on a symbolic level, regardless of if people were not taking up the opportunity to be enrolled. But Will, on the land rights issue, after the Yirrkala Buck petitions, Menzies does announce a committee of inquiry in Parliament to look into this issue, and changes are made after that. They don't unfortunately help the Yolngu people on that, and the mine goes ahead and they lost their land there. But changes are incrementally being made as the Menzies government and I guess subsequent governments start to navigate the very tricky issue of Indigenous land rights. Is that right?
Yes, but I'd come back to the beginning of our conversation here and say that what the Menzies government did through Hasluck was always focused on the Northern Territory.
Yeah.
And, of course, in a sense, what the Commonwealth ends up doing in the 1970s is focused on the Northern Territory too. I mean, the Whitlam government, when it gets into this act, it ends up basically acting in the Northern Territory because it can. It takes a long time for this to become national through native title in the 1990s. So, and to give Hasluck and Menzies their due, they set up in the Northern Territory some of the financial provisions which allowed for mining royalty equivalents, monies from Indigenous land, which was then called reserves, to be applied to Indigenous people and purposes. So that was seen as quite progressive too. My colleague John Altman has written quite a bit about that, so how some of the financial provisions were set up quite early. So there was, a fund in a sense, that was their response to the Yirrkala stuff. Well, we haven't really consulted you about letting miners come into your reserve, but hey, you can have the equivalent money that the Commonwealth's getting, the mining royalty equivalents, to sort of use for Indigenous purposes. So in a sense, that was what they did know how to respond, but of course that wasn't enough.
No, indeed. But what was the reception at the time to the royalties being put into a fund for the Indigenous people? Was there a positive reception? Was it? How was it used?
I suspect, as in later years, that it remained fairly firmly under the control of the Northern Territory Administration Director of Welfare, and as in later years, that there's a sort of an advisory committee of Indigenous Northern Territorians who advise that director about how that money can be spent, but that's sort of quite contentious. I mean, we have examples of this coming right through to the present, where it's ultimately up to the minister, the Commonwealth Minister for Indigenous Affairs, how this money is spent. And so it's sort of, yes, it's money that's for Indigenous purposes, but it's still under the control of the Commonwealth Minister.
Right. So the local people don't actually get to determine how it's used, which must have been somewhat frustrating.
They advise and recommend, and yes, and sometimes don't. Their advice is taken, and then all things are good. But sometimes their advice is not taken.
Yeah.
And then it says, "Well, is this our money or isn't it?" So you can see how it plays out.
Yeah, absolutely.
And ultimately, actually, it's not your money; it's still public money. It's sort of sequestered. Yes, we'll put aside this public money for these sorts of purposes, but it's still public money. So you can see the tension. They just play through.
Yeah, indeed. Well, in the early 1960s, there was a conference on Aboriginal culture, which was a precursor to the establishment of IATSIS, which is also, I think, a particularly underappreciated development in Indigenous policy in Australia, where there was actually now a centre that was studying Aboriginal culture and made it really part of mainstream intellectual inquiry, and started an appreciation, of course, of Aboriginal art and all aspects of language and it's amazing some of the archives that IATSIS has of lost languages now, of Indigenous languages, all these recordings that were made in the 1960s. Can you tell me about the impact of that conference and the decision around forming IATSIS?
The white politician who gets celebrated for this is Billy Wentworth, who is not, he's really more of, he's in the Menzies governments, but he's a backbencher through most. So he's a sort of a younger person. So he's really more coming through in the Holt period. And so in a sense, the old guard here seems to be Menzies and Hasluck, who've sort of established themselves in the late 40s and 50s, and then the new guard that's coming through is Billy Wentworth and Holt to some extent. And they are showing themselves to be a bit more receptive to Indigenous group rights and the valuing of Indigenous cultures. So this establishment of the Australian Institute of Aboriginal Studies, which in 64, 65, seems to be the push of the younger new guard, and it's W.C. Wentworth, and that the IATSIS, as we now call it, putting the Torres Strait Islander bit in the middle as well. They still have a Wentworth lecture every year.
Oh, do they?
Which celebrates. Yeah. So it's their big annual lecture is the Wentworth lecture. So they sort of celebrate their origins as coming from Wentworth, and he became Minister for Aboriginal Policy and Social Security in the Holt years and then into the Gorton years. Not particularly notable in a way, like quite a short period, nothing like the 12 years that Hasluck put in and effective Minister for Indigenous Policy under Menzies by being the Minister for Territories. I suppose that's Wentworth maybe started what you've thought the newer tradition that you turn over these ministers in 2 or 3 years. In Indigenous policy, there's a lot of talk, of the large numbers of different ministers we've had and the large numbers of different administrative arrangements we've had in this sort of era since the 60s. And certainly no one has served as Minister for Indigenous Affairs in the Commonwealth for as long as Hasluck served. 12 years in a portfolio is pretty exceptional. But there have been some quite long-serving ministers in the Indigenous Affairs portfolio in the years since. So Robert Tickner went for 6 years.
Okay.
From 1990, the beginning of ATSIC, right through to the end of the Keating government when they lost to Howard in March 96. And Nigel Scullion was Minister for Indigenous Affairs under 3 Prime Ministers. So he was a long-serving from 2013 to 2019. So there's another 6-year server. So it's not the case that, people came and went very quickly through this portfolio all the time. But there were times when people did come and go fairly quickly.
Yeah. But it shows the commitment of Hasluck, doesn't it? I mean, career-long commitment of Hasluck, that he was in the portfolio for so long, for 12 years, and then obviously, regarded very highly that he was appointed as Minister for External Affairs afterwards. So, quite a substantial political figure. Obviously, someone that Menzies could trust and rely on to deliver.
Absolutely.
With by the sounds of it, not a huge amount of intervention from Menzies' behalf. That he was able to do that and bring through pretty significant reforms in that area, and no doubt balancing some tricky relations with the states as well on the issue.
Exactly, and well, not only that, but he there's no doubt that he had a commitment. Hasluck had a commitment, and I think Menzies was probably pretty comfortable with that commitment. So as well as Hasluck having worked in this area as a journalist and as a historian in the 1930s in Western Australia, and he returned to it in the 1980s in retirement and wrote a book called Shades of Darkness, which was giving his perspective on all these years. So he put the time in, not only to doing it then, but also to writing about it in the 1980s. And that book, Shades of Darkness, was a great I think it came out in 88, and it allowed me to get a sense of what the Hasluck-Menzies project was in Indigenous policy in the 50s and 60s. It looked old. By the time I was reading it in 88, 89, 90, yes, it looked old-fashioned, but you could see the consistency.
And you could obviously appreciate the progressiveness of their policies in the context of the times.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's all very well to think we've got everything perfectly right in 2022, but we weren't around in 1949.
They were progressives in their time. There's no two ways about that. But they were sort of consistent. And so I wrote a piece about Hasluck where I said what he had was a consistent approach, and over time it changed him from being a liberal reformer to being a conservative, because 25 years later he still had the same approach. And so, the times went past him. But he did do important reforming work in his time, and Menzies supported him in it.
Well, thank you, Will Sanders, for a wonderful and illuminating discussion on Indigenous policy under Menzies and, of course, his long-standing Minister for Territories, Paul Hasluck. It's been a pleasure to have you on the Afternoon Light podcast.
And the pleasure has been mine, Georgina. Thank you.
The Afternoon Light podcast is brought to you by the Robert Menzies Institute at the University of Melbourne. You can find more about the Institute and our podcast at robertmenziesinstitute.org.au. We're also on Twitter, on Facebook and LinkedIn. We look forward to you joining our show next week. Thank you.